predominantly chapters 37 through 50, the end of the book, are about Joseph. So why are we focusing so much on Joseph in this story? We've already seen who's the actual son of Jacob that's chosen. Judah. So why are we going to spend the bulk of the next 13 chapters talking about Joseph? Okay, Judah wouldn't have lived if Joseph hadn't done what he did. Is there a problem? There was, Cameron. Well, that's interesting. Why don't you take the camera with you and see if it'll reconnect as you get closer to the machine? Then you got to come set it back up in the proper place, so don't move the stand. Just pull the little yellow cord. So that is the primary aspect of it. Look at chapter 45. And to be fair, it's not just Judah that's delivered. It's Judah's brothers and his father. But we look at chapter 45, verses 5 through 8. And now do not be grieved or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years. There still are 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve you, a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. And so there's some indication there that the reason that all the things that we're going to read about in Joseph's life were allowed to happen was because God was preserving these descendants of Jacob, whose name had been changed to Israel. So the descendants, the children of Israel, were going to be saved through these events. Look at chapter 50, verses 19 and 20. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Am I in God's place? And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. And so this goes to expand this a little bit more as we think about it. The primary purpose of our story is to show us how Judah was preserved to have his offspring in Christ come into the world. But that's not all that was preserved. Who else immediately was preserved in a very obvious way? The Israelites, but beyond the Israelites, the Egyptians. That's the obvious people, because that is actually the place where Joseph does his work. And so they obviously benefit from it. They play a big role in the story a little bit later on as well. And then every other nation around there is going through this same famine and the same problems. The only people who had prior knowledge about the extent of the famine and the length of the famine was who? Joseph was the only individual, and therefore the Egyptians were the only nation. They were the only ones that could do anything to prepare, which means all the other nations around were caught unprepared. If it wasn't for what God did through Joseph, none of these people would have survived a 7-year famine. And so it's extremely important. And this is one of the ways that Egypt became the powerhouse that Egypt became. And the wealth that they had came from doing what? Selling grain to these people when they didn't have any for themselves. And what happens with markets when things are scarce? Prices go up. They got wealthy off of these things. That comes into the story again later as well. And I'll go ahead and bring it up now, because by the time we we probably won't get to it because we've already studied Well, we didn't study the exact Exodus, we studied Numbers. But when they fled Egypt after their bondage, what did the Egyptians do? Gave them money and stuff, and all. The wealth of Egypt was handed over to the children of Israel, which is why the children of Israel had all of the provisions that they had when they left Egypt and were able to build the things that God instructed them to build and to equip themselves as an army and do all the other things that they needed to do in order to go and take the land. That was all the providence of God. And we learn an important lesson about God working through providence in these events. Did God force anyone to do anything? No. He didn't force Joseph's brothers to do what they did. And in fact, Joseph points that out. And Moses, by inspiration, records it the way that it's recorded so we can grasp this. What you meant to be evil, God used for good. And it gives some insight into potentially passages like the one in the book of Hebrews. It says that God causes all things to work together for good for those that are his. That doesn't mean he controls every little decision that's made or everything that happens. It means that he can use every decision that's made and everything that happens to accomplish his purposes and his will. That's also why the people that make those decisions are still held accountable when they're evil. The reason why Egypt was judged was because of their evil. The reason why some of Joseph's brothers were judged was because of their evil. They're still responsible for the choices that they make. But it didn't thwart the plan of God. And so what we're seeing in this study is that even decisions that people make that aren't considering God at all, aren't considering the will of God at all, you'll be able to remember when we studied Abraham a little while ago, he made decisions based upon things that God said, right? So he knew, for instance, that God had made a promise about Isaac, and so he went ahead and did what God told him to do, believing that God would do whatever was necessary. So his decisions to obey God and the decisions that he made about life reflected his faith and confidence in what God had said. But the people of Egypt didn't care what God said. Their decisions had nothing to do with God. In fact, when we get to their story, Pharaoh is quite hard-hearted and arrogant when they come and say, God has said, let my people go. What's his initial response? Who is this God? Because what did he think? What did the Egyptian pharaohs believe? They were God. Who is this God? Why should I listen to him? Was his response. The decisions that Egypt made had nothing to do with what God desired, and yet God could still use them to accomplish his purposes. We're going to read about someone named Potiphar. He doesn't think about God. He's not going, well, okay, God said this and gave this vision and did this thing, and God is saying that this is going to, so what can I do to help that along? That's not why he makes the decisions he makes. Why does Potiphar make the decisions he makes? Because it's in his own personal best interest. And yet God still uses them to move Joseph into the place that he needs Joseph to be. By the way, he takes a very weird trek to become the ruler of the free world of his day. Wasn't so free, but the greatest nation of the day was Egypt. And he ends up being the ruler of Egypt. Not an Egyptian, and not through normal political channels. A very, very backdoor way to become a nation's leader. And yet, that's where God needs him. That's where he ends up. Despite all the other choices that would work against that end. that had been made, it still happens. That's part of the things that we can learn from this story, is that God isn't limited the way that we are. We can make plans and other people can do things, and our plans can be thwarted because of what other people do. Here's an humbling thing to realize. There is nothing that I can do to stop the will of God. No matter how much power I get, no matter how much wealth I get, no matter how big the army is that I control, I can't stop the will of God. Neither can I help God along. What do I need to do? Humbly pursue the righteous path that God has given me to pursue and wait for him. Because I'm going to tell you, if I was Joseph, there's several decades of this that I'd want to just skip and get to the end part. Because the living in the palace in Egypt and being powerful and wealthy part, that's kind of cool. But some of the stuff that happens before that, not so cool. Not things that people go, hey, you know what, I hope that I grow up and this happens to me. He didn't even have a very joyful childhood. And that's another little side story that we could learn from. He was his father's favorite. We're going to find that out in just a moment. Did that make his life easy? No, not at all. By the way, his brothers, a lot older than him. So don't think about somebody that's just a couple of years older than him that doesn't like him. And no, these are grown men while he's a youth. And they can make his life miserable because ultimately he's left to their charge. And so it's not always, some of the things that we think of, well, isn't that lucky? They're going to get everything. Look at how the father's doting on that. No, that's not necessarily a lucky life. It made his life much more difficult. All right, so chapter 37. Now Jacob lived in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. These are the records of the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when he was 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. Again, his brothers much older than him. I guess much is a broad and vague term. And some of them were just a little older than him, and some of them were older than that. And so, but they're all older than him. Remember, he's the one that's born in Jacob's old age. Joseph, 17 years of age, he was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. And so here's problem number one. Baby brother, who's daddy's favorite, runs home from the pasture in the flock, which, by the way, is you spend time living out there in the land with the sheep. Not really a pleasant experience either for most of our standards. But anyway, comes home, and what does he do? He tells on them and says, hey, they're not doing it right. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than all of his sons because he was a son of his old age, and he made him a varicolored tunic. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, and so they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. This is a dysfunctional home. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, please listen to this dream which I have had. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheep rose up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheep. And his brothers said to him, are you actually going to reign over us? Now, by the way, that's not a legitimate question. I don't think that there's any reason or anything in this to believe that they had any real wait a minute. is that really what's going to happen kind of a concept. It's rhetorical and sarcastic. Oh, our little baby brother, you're going to reign over us. Really? Are you really going to rule over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Now, he had still another dream and related it to his brothers and said, lo, I've had still another dream. Now, he's apparently slow because his brothers hate him. And he tells them the first dream, and they hate him even more. And he has his next dream, and he doesn't go, you know what, I'm going to keep this into myself. He goes and he tells them, I've had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bound down to me. And he related it to his father and to his brothers. And his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have had? Shall I and your mother and your brothers actually come to bow ourselves down before you to the ground? So even as his father's a little put out at this, by the way, these are important at the end of the story. So don't forget the dreams. At this point, we don't know what they mean. We're going to find out what they mean. The point of what follows is showing us how we get from the 17-year-old having the visions to the reality and fulfillment of the visions. And what the visions even mean. Because how are the brothers and the dad taking the vision? I'm sorry? Okay.
Who are you to say that we have to bow down? I'm your father. You listen to me. I'm your older brother. You have to respect.
Right. So they think that this is just a foolish dream of a young, arrogant, spoiled child. That's one aspect of it. They think that it means that Joseph thinks that he is what? Better than them. Does it have anything to do with that at all? No. And is there enough information in the dreams themselves to even know what they mean? No. Dreams come up later in this story as well. They're part of what moves Joseph along because God empowers him to do what? Interpret certain dreams. But there's no interpretation here. And listen, I don't care what you do. If all you know is there's 12 sheaves and one of them's erect in the middle and the rest of them are bound down to it, what does that mean? That much he knew. Right. Yeah, I mean, the relationship, right. The relationship between Joseph and his brothers is pretty straightforward, but where that plays out and how that plays out, nothing to hear about that. Zero. And so they just kind of made some assumptions. And the assumptions are, you think you're better than us. Do you really think that you're going to rule us? Well, all I'm telling you is what my dream was. That would be my response. I don't know what it means. I don't know when it means. Yeah, I don't know if it's going to be something that happens tomorrow or something that happens 100 years from now. I don't know.
Either said or implied more meaning to this. Like in verse 8, they didn't need more for his dreams and for his words.
Right.
There may have been a little more conversation than we get.
Oh, there definitely was probably more conversation than we get because he got pushback, I'm sure, and then he defended himself, I'm sure. But we're left with the observation that all he knew was that at some point, for some reason, he was going to be in a position where his siblings, and then later even his parents, are identified in the second dream, are going to be, and here's the deal, I'm going to say reliant upon him. not even subservient to him, although I think that becomes true as well, but that's another story. I don't think the point of this is that he is going to rule them. I think the point of this is that he's going to provide for them and have the position of Savior. Can I use that term? Because that's another next thing you need to think about in terms of Joseph is a shadow figure, an Old Testament shadow of the Messiah. What did Jesus come to do? To seek and save those who were lost. What did Joseph do? He saved and delivered his brethren. Who were the Israelites? Jesus' brethren. That there's a shadow substance reflection of the work of Jesus in this story. Yes, ma'am.
Do you think he even thought about what the dream meant?
I don't know. I know that there's nothing in the text. Right. We do thanks to hindsight and revelation.
He was 17, maybe he just thought it was a dream.
It caused problems with a situation that was already problematic. By the way, there's another really, really secondary and sidebar issue, and that is when there are problems, everything is taken in the most negative way possible. His brothers already didn't like him. This dream's just another reason not to like him. And so they happily take that because that's what we do. I don't like you, and so I'm going to interpret everything you do and say in the way that supports my dislike of you as much as I can. And so we need to be careful for that as well. That's just a kind of a side note about the nature of man that's worth learning. It's not really what the story's about, but it does show us that. All right, so verse 11, your brothers are jealous of him because his father kept the saying in mind. And so that's an important verse because the father at least is going, what does this mean? And remembering it, which continues to cause problems with his brothers even more, right? Because they become jealous because now dad is in the back of his mind going, well, wait a minute, what exactly does this dream mean? Then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them. And he said, I will go. Then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. You remember where this started was him coming home from an adventure much like this and him giving a bad report about his brothers. So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, what are you looking for? And he said, I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock. And the man said, they've moved from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. When they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him and put him to death. I'm going to stop here for a moment. How did they know it was him? His coat. Okay, so before he's even close enough for them to really realize it, they recognize the coat. And they go, all right, here's our chance. And they start plotting to put him to death. How much do you have to hate your brother to actually conspire to kill them? Now, I know, listen, I had 3 siblings and I raised 4 kids. I know that there are days when you say, I'm going to kill you, but you don't actually mean it. They meant it. Yeah, there's
this a little.
Yeah, rough characters. Yeah, rough characters. The whole lot of them are rough characters if you really think about it. The whole thing is just, it's a disaster. They said to one another, here comes the dreamer. Now, they didn't forget about the dreams either, did they? They kept them in mind in a very different way than their father did, though. Now then, come, let us kill him, throw him into one of the pits, and we will say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. And so the whole idea is let's kill him and let's see what happens. Now, there is an irony here that could be overlooked because it doesn't come up until something that said way up in the Hebrew letter about Isaac, who was way before Joseph. But if you'll remember, Abraham was asked to offer Isaac as an offering. And when we get to that discussion of it in Hebrews chapter 11, it said that Abraham considered that God was even able to raise him from the dead if that's what he needed to do to fulfill the promise. Let's see what will become of his dream. Listen, if they had killed him and God still needed him, what could God have done? Raise him from the dead if he needed to. Just like it was said of Isaac. So their ideas and their plan is, let's just kill him and we're going to put a stop to that whole notion that we're going to be bound down to him one day. But Reuben heard this. By the way, there's another level that we can think about this. If they're the brothers, then what else are they in competition for? The birthright. And I think that there's a fair probability that some of them are thinking, oh, he's dad's favorite, now he's having these dreams, and dad's kind of going, well, maybe, and maybe dad's going to give him that first position. And maybe he would have, I don't know. But anyway, Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let us not take his life. And so Reuben says, okay, killing him is a bit too far. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that is in the wilderness, but do not lay hands on him that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. And so Reuben has this mindset, well, let's just throw him into a pit. We don't need to actually kill him. We don't need to actually shed his blood. Let's throw him into a pit and leave him. Now, the implication to the rest of the brothers is what? You throw somebody in a pit and you desert them, what happens? Unless somebody comes along and saves them, they're going to die. So they're going to be satisfied. And Reuben's thinking, hey, I can sneak back behind them and actually restore him to his father, get him out and send him home. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers. See, he's not even there yet. He's still getting it. This whole plan's been plotted out before he even arrives. When he reached his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the very colored tunic that was on him. They took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Okay, so there's some significance to being told that. They didn't give him water. There wasn't any water there. It wasn't a pit that had water in it. When you're in a hole in the middle of the desert and there is no water, there's a couple things you can't do. You can't stop the sun from beating down on you all day long, and you can't drink and eat. And if you can't drink and eat and the sun beats down on you all day long, you don't live very long. They sat down to eat a meal. So they throw him in a pit and they go have a meal. This is cold. As they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, with their camels bearing Aramaic gum and balm and myrrh on their way to bring them down to Egypt. So we got a caravan of merchants that are moving product to go sell in Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his blood? So Judah comes up and steps up and says, yeah, there's no real value in us letting him die. Now you got to keep in mind, Reuben's planning on actually getting him out and letting him go home. But Judah don't know that. Judah's interpreting this as we're throwing him in there to leave him to die. He says, well, there's no profit in that. So you don't think that Judah's being a really nice guy. He doesn't, I guess, want to see him dead, but he says, yeah, if he dies, but if we sell him, see, then we get rid of him and we make some money. Now that's a win-win, right? What a loving brother. Anyway, what profit is it for us to kill our brother and cover up his lid? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh, and his brothers listened to him. Then some Midianite traders passed by, so they pulled him up and lifted Joseph out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 25 shekels of silver. Thus they brought Joseph to Egypt. I'm going to stop there for just a minute. Anybody pick up on the issue? The Ishmaelites are coming. They sold him to the Midianites, and then they sold him to the Ishmaelites. Some Midianite traders passed by, is verse 28. So we got Ishmaelites in verse 27, Midianites in verse 28, Ishmaelites at the end of verse 28. Is it the Ishmaelites or is it the Midianites? And who are those people? We got 6 minutes to either answer this entire question or this is where we begin next week. Okay, and Ishmael was Isaac's brother, Abraham's other son. Who were the Midianites? I'm sorry? No, but that's a good guess. It's real close. What we forget about is, what did Abraham do after his wife died? He remarried Keturah. Guess who one of Keturah's children was? Midian. So they're also the descendants of Abraham. Ishmael was one of Abraham's sons, and Midian was among one of his sons. Let's see, Genesis 25, verses 1 and 2, I think, is where we learned about that. Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. So these are the descendants of Abraham from one of his other children than Isaac. The Ishmaelites were also the descendants of Abraham. Where did the Ishmaelites live? They lived in the region of Midian. When Ishmael fled, they all lived in the same part of the world. And so herein lies some of the problem. And I'll go ahead and tell you, this is not the only place in the Bible that uses these terms almost interchangeably. Look at Judges chapter 8 with me for just a minute. We'll read a little section from Judges chapter 8. You're going to see the exact same thing. Now, the reason we're taking time with this is because there's a lot of people that try to make hay out of this and say, oh, this is a contradiction right here. No, it's not. Judges 8, starting in verse 22. The men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your son, also your son's sons, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. But Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. Yet Gideon said to them, I would request that you each of you give me an earring from his spoil, for they had gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And they said, we will surely give them. So they spared out a garment, and every one of them threw the earring from his spoil. And the weight of the gold earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple robes which were on the kings of Midian. Wait a minute, we're back to the Midians again, right? So we got the people of Midian that he has defeated, and it says he asked for their gold earrings because they were Ishmaelites. And then we're right here to the kings of Midian, and besides the neckband. So when you read through the Old Testament here, there's really no distinguishing between these people. They were all living in the same place, living together. They were all the descendants of Abraham. And so the Ishmaelites were among the Midianites. The Midianites could have been the physical descendants of the man Midian, or it could apply to anyone who lived in the region that became known as Midian. Like everybody in this room, or what? Is it Louisianian? Is that the word? I was Texan before I became a Louisianian, but I'm not a Texan anymore. Why? I don't live there anymore. I was born a Texan, so I'll always be a Texan, but that's another story. So there's not an issue here. The reason why it vacillates between the two is because they can be considered almost indistinguishable. And I suspect that it was Ishmaelites from Midian is what my suspicion is. But that's not really here or there. Any other questions or comments about that? Do we need to talk about that anymore? Are we satisfied? All right, so Lord willing, we'll pick up in verse 29 next time.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, with the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love. Wonderful story of love, wonderful story of love, wonderful.